Everybody, I'm here with Chris Rufo. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a filmmaker, he's an author, he's an activist, and someone very interested in exploring some of the intellectual roots of wokeism, of critical race theory, et cetera. And this interest brings him close to my own interests. And he's just come out with this book, America's Cultural Revolution. So, Chris, thanks for being with us today. And I'm eager to explore these themes with you. Can I begin with this? Often when I become critical of wokeism within a Catholic framework, people say, well, wait a minute, how could you be critical of wokeism? It just means you're awake to social injustice, you're concerned for the poor, and you want to do something about it. And wasn't Martin Luther King woke, and Dorothy Day was woke, and isn't Catholic social teaching essentially woke? And a lot of my time is spent saying, well, no, it's coming out of a very different philosophical matrix. Catholic social teaching is coming out of I'd say, essentially biblical matrix. And wokeism is from somewhere else. And I found your book very helpful in exploring some of that. Just talk to me a little bit about that problem that some of us face when we're critical of it. It's like, well, what do you mean? Shouldn't everyone be for social justice?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the big phenomenon that's happening that really confuses people is that woke ideology or left-wing racialist ideology operates at two levels. There's a level of euphemism, all of which sound very nice. They're very pleasing. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, solidarity sometimes. But then if you actually dig under the euphemisms, which are marketing words, you find an ideology that is very different. It doesn't stem from certainly the Christian tradition. It doesn't stem from the natural rights tradition. It doesn't stem from the kind of traditional mid-century civil rights tradition.
In fact, it's against all those things.
It's against all of those things. And so you have to actually do your homework. You actually have to understand where it comes from. And where it comes from is a couple of different traditions, but most prominently Marxism or neo-Marxism. You have someone like Herbert Marcuse. You have the Black radical tradition, which is an atheist tradition, a militant revolutionary tradition that sought to overturn the system of government in the United States. And then you have this really ugly brew of postmodernism and gender theory that seeks to erase the very basic fabric of the cosmos. It rejects the kind of world of creation in favor of a world of unlimited human manipulation. And so what I've tried to do with the book is essentially that, is to say, let's look at the euphemisms, but let's look underneath them to find what's really happening.
Do you find some of that neo-Gnostic, the oldest heresy in the church that keeps asserting itself century in, century out, and the view that, the real me is kind of hidden deep in there somewhere, and the body is malleable, the body can be changed according to the whims of the real inner self. And of course, the church recognized very early on, go back to St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, that's repugnant to a Christian or biblical anthropology. Do you find some of that neo-Gnostic in form?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's most pronounced on gender because, look, I think politics is largely driven in the United States by the left on race issues. That's the great mechanism by which they feel they can change the structures of society, the economy, the law, the Constitution, et cetera. But there's a separate strain that has a separate lineage, and we think of it as gender theory, we think of it as the kind of trans activism, and that's very much predicated on the rejection of any concept of human nature. Human nature is what they call kind of normative structure. It's part of the sexual normativity, which is an oppressive structure that's created by human invention. And they actually believe that they can manipulate the physical world, the biological world, to meet any ideological demand. Men can become women, men can become pregnant, whatever kind of small phrases that you might have heard are based on this idea of a rejection of any natural limits and using technology to transcend not just the categories of male and female, which are embedded in the human experience, but actually
in our biology all the way down. I mean, every level of biology,
all the way down.
Gender.
If you look at it from a scientific account, if you look at it from a biblical account, but they actually think that they can transcend the limitation of human nature as such, and so it's a movement that is at the end of the day an anti-human movement, and you see it most pronounced. And a lot of the reporting that I've done recently is looking at where this leads in medical practice. And you have some surgical procedures that they're doing that are far beyond Dr. Frankenstein. I mean, things that are so horrific. It's almost hard to mention, but they really believe that there is no human essence.
Right.
That it's all accidental, it's all contingent.
You know that term they use a lot, essentialism, right, as a disparaging term. And it's a Sartrean thing, isn't it? Where Sartre says, my existentialism means that existence precedes essence. So my freedom comes first, then I decide who or what I am. Well, that's, from the French Salon of the 1940s and 50s. Well, now it's in the mind of every teenager in America, right? And essentialism, some view that there's a nature, there's a givenness to our bodies, to our anthropology. That's the problem. That's oppressive, right? But that's repugnant to our Catholic social teaching. One reason why Pope Francis, and I can tell you this from direct experience, he told us when I was a bishop out in California, I want you to stand against the gender ideology because it's repugnant to the Bible and to our anthropology. And we're on dangerous ground, aren't we? When we start playing that game of my existence completely trumps essence.
Yeah, I mean, we're on dangerous ground, but I think most importantly, if you look at it as a practical matter, it just doesn't work.
Oh, right.
It is disproven over and over and over, and that's really the problem with all of these revolutionary ideologies. At the end of the day, they are revolutions against nature, against human nature, against the social essence of what makes us human beings in community. And they have this romantic and idealistic notion, which is very attractive to people, especially young people, that you can overcome any limitation. That actually the limitations, the proscriptions of human nature are structures of oppression that can be abolished. And so it's very attractive to people, but ultimately the theme in the book, the process that you see in the revolution and the process you see in all these revolutions is one of idealism turning into disillusionment, turning into nihilism. Mm-hmm. And you see that largely in the philosophical line of thought and philosophical reasoning. You see it personally in many of these stories of the thinkers of the time. But then you also see it, and this is the most tragic and devastating, in the lives of people who are manipulated by these ideologies.
Right.
So those kids who
are suffering from it. It's not just an abstraction. Right.
And I think that you have to tell them quite the opposite. There is an essence. Mm-hmm. There is a human nature. There is a way that things ought to be. And there are kind of a component of that is there are limitations that you should not only respect as limitations, but actually those limitations are what give us the constraints and the bounds of being human.
Right.
And I think that it's something that people are hesitant to teach people are hesitant to even say.
Don't you think it's contingent in a way upon that modern sense of freedom as pure choice? I hover indifferently above the yes and the no, and I can decide purely on the basis of my own integrity which way I'm going to go. Where classical freedom, biblical and classical freedom, is more the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good effortless. So I become a free speaker of English. I become a free player of the piano, a free golfer, in the measure that I submit myself to these objective norms. And the more I internalize those norms, the freer I become to golf or to speak or whatever. But see, I think that view of freedom has been so occluded by this modern sense of freedom, of self-invention. But I think that's why you see the numbers on depression, anxiety, suicidality among young people spiking. That's a terrible space to live in, where I've got to invent my own values. I invent this on the basis of my own freedom. That's where I quite agree with you. I think there's a real danger. It's not just a theoretical problem. This is a real existential problem, isn't it?
I think that is, and I think that if you look at it, it's at heart unlimited freedom leads to nihilism,
right?
Because all that you have is the ego and unlimited choice. I mean, boundless choice. It's this open terrain, but it's a brutal place to put people because ultimately it's false.
Right.
There aren't unlimited choices, and sure, we should seek to maximize our free expression. We should seek to find our own essence. We should seek to cultivate ourselves towards our genius. But doing that in an unlimited environment of choices is very destructive. And I think it untethers freedom from responsibility. And so the classical notions of freedom were hitched. I mean, it was explained to me once in a very good way as freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. And freedom for what is the essential question. And what I found in my work not just intellectually writing the book, but in my practical work as a trustee of a public college in Florida, for example, working on reforms in higher education, is that I ask academics and I ask my critics, okay, free inquiry, freedom of speech, freedom to create new academic departments. For what?
Right, for what?
Toward what?
Yeah.
And you get this blank look. They look at you like you're a crazy person.
Because teleology disappeared with modernity. I mean, you see it in
Gone.
the sciences, then you see it in the human sciences. If teleology disappears, all that's left is my self-generating freedom.
That's right.
But right, classically, freedom from sin in a religious context, or freedom from attachment, freedom from addiction, so I can be free for the attainment of the good. That would be the way a classical mind would think about it. But the modern reading is freedom from any kind of external oppression, so I can find freedom for self-expression. That's a dead end, though. I think that's a fundamental shift that in some ways has given rise to a lot of this business.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that if you look at that as the basic philosophical bedrock of these movements,
Yes.
and then it shifts, though. It becomes very interesting because they attack on various lines. You have race, you have gender, you have a couple of other kind of minor lines of attack.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I was perplexed by looking at the figures in the book, I profile 4 of the great revolutionaries of the 1960s and 70s that have had the most profound impact on our culture today, really exposed in 2020 when all of our institutions were captured by these ideologies. But I reading their work, listening to their interviews, looking at their letters and correspondence, investigating their body of thought in a way that hadn't been done before in this manner, I was always asking them, in dialogue with the study, is what do they actually want? What is their vision of the good? What does social justice mean to them? What does liberation entail? And text after text after text, it was an empty answer.
Right.
It was they were very good at describing the systems of oppression in their mind, but their solutions were nothing more than appeals to these vague terms that were signifiers with no signified. They were kind of words without meaning. Yeah. So, okay, well, what does liberation look like? What do you want? And I think that ultimately, what happens is that they have charged the negative side of the dialectic, meaning that they can kind of chew up, they can deconstruct, they can dismantle, they can criticize, they can load any kind of negative critique of the systems as they exist, but can never answer that question, what ought they be? It's a purely negative conception, and that's why I think that especially young people and parents of young people that are looking at their institutions, there's a gnawing sense that there's no there. Yeah. That it's an empty ideology.
The world of objective value kind of evanesced. Classically, there's values that appear, moral values, aesthetic values, epistemic values. And the elders were meant to sort of draw young people into that world. Let me show you the beauty of this mathematical truth, or let me show you this Gothic cathedral. Let me show you this moral excellence. And now bring your freedom into line with those so that you might, in your distinctive way, and I think that's where the individualism comes in legitimately. In your distinctive way, you're going to become, intellectual or a moral agent or an artist, right? But see, that got mixed up at the beginning of modernity, it seems to me, and we're seeing in some ways the full, consequence of that. I do want to go back to the central argument of your book, which I think is really important, and I haven't heard it articulated quite this way before. And let me see if I get this right. That the really radical movements, late 60s, early 70s in our country. So think of the Weather Underground, think of Angela Davis, think of the Black Panther movement. I remember those as a kid. When I was a little 10-year-old kid, those were, kind of haunting our imagination. That they dramatically failed politically at that time. I mean, they really tried in some sense to launch a revolution. They dramatically failed. But they didn't go away. They went largely into academia. So the leaders of those movements went into academia. And there was a long gestation period where a lot of the leaders of those movements did their own research, taught a generation or two after them. And then all that came spilling out in a rather surprising way in the summer of 2020 And then in an even more surprising way, rapidly took over most of the cultural institutions. I mean, from entertainment to corporate world to the government. And so it's like the 50-year delayed victory of the radical movements of the early 70s in this unexpected way. Am I getting it right? It's sort of the way you read what's going on behind a lot of the wokest movement.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the main concept underlying that process is what they described in the early 1970s as the long march through the institutions. And this is, of course, an allusion to Chairman Mao. Well, he wasn't chairman at the time, but Mao Zedong's long march in the Chinese Civil War. And the basic theory was this. They tried armed revolution against the United States. There were thousands of bombings in the period of the early 1970s. They were executing police officers. They believed in what they called the FOCO theory. If we can have spectacular acts of revolutionary violence, it will inspire the masses to overthrow the United States government. And then we can seize the means of the state, and we can seize the means of production. We can take over the Ford factory. We can take over the air conditioner plant. The old Marxist dream, kind of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. This, of course, by Richard Nixon's reelection in 1972 was totally shattered, repudiated, discredited, and even the Herbert Marcuse, who was the leading philosophical light of this movement, conceded that the Nixon's counter-revolution had won. The radical movement was finished. But like all bad ideas, they're never quite finished. They have a zombie-like quality where they're undead. They come back. And so what they said is we need to regroup. We need to go into the universities, which is our primary institutional environment that's most hospitable. And we need to change our theory of revolution from seizing the means of physical production to seizing the means of intellectual production. And then what you have is a decade, a second decade, a third decade, and then all the way for now, a half century
50 years
of deliberate work to take over the academic institutions, to take over the language that we use, and to take these ideas from, let's say, the Black Panther Party revolutionary literature and launder them passing them through euphemism, passing them through the organs of legitimation, the academic journals and the university programs, into the K through 12 school curriculum, into the diversity training curriculum in companies, into public policy using those same ideas. And one of the most shocking things was that I was going back into the archives and I pulled all the old Black Panther literature. These kind of really shocking pamphlets with images of them, executing police officers and all their revolutionary slogans. And then I compared it to the K through 12 school curriculum in 2020 in a place like Buffalo, New York, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And you hold them up side by side, and minus the graphic violent imagery, minus some of the dated revolutionary language, the key concepts and the key arguments were identical. And so you have this transmission of ideology from the furthest fringes of violent revolutionary ideas in the 1960s that's now being promoted at the kindergarten level to every public school kid in Buffalo, New York. That, to me, is the great symbol of what they've achieved. And certainly, 2020 was the echo following 1968. That's the story that I'm telling, and I hope that it really alerts people to what's really going on.
I remember this a couple of years ago. Jordan Peterson was on Bill Maher's program, and Maher is a great critic of wokeism and its extremism. And he said, "Professor, where did all this come from?" And Peterson said, without hesitation, the universities. That's my question. Like, what was rejected clearly in the early 1970s as a political reality? The country said, absolutely not. Did it just take that long gestation period? Like, how did it find such success in the university? And then the next question would be then, I know 2020, the whole country kind of went mad, but what was it that allowed this thing to spread so widely and to attach itself so deeply to the psyche when it had been rejected? Was it the fact that it was more explicit in those days and it was more implicit later? How did it happen?
Yeah, it went through this really amazing process of cultural conquest.
Yeah.
And they're explicit about it. If you read their writings, if you read the text from their gatherings, you see that they're very deliberately trying to work laterally through bureaucracies and say, all right, first we're going to take university humanities departments. Then we're going to take graduate schools of education, which create K through 12 curriculum, which train teachers. Then we're going to move laterally, and they were starting to do this already in the 70s. We can seek influence over corporate life by going through HR departments and taking our ideas and turning them into HR trainings and racial sensitivity trainings, they called them in the 70s. And then they had this very deliberate strategy to say, we're going to go institution by institution. We're going to modify our ideas for the most success. They did it over a long period of time. And then what you have happening on the right is this enormous mistake. Conservatives, let's say broadly, cultural conservatives, political conservatives, religious conservatives, at the end of the Cold War, were lulled into believing that communism as an ideology was finished. You had the great battle between communism and capitalism in the 20th century. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had been vanquished, buried, salted over.
We thought so, yeah. 1989, I was in Paris doing my doctoral studies when the Berlin Wall came down and there was this, massive celebration. Then the events after that and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right, we thought it was the end of history.
They thought it was the end of history. And so they really stopped being vigilant. And then they also made an enormous mistake by dismissing these ideas as they were moving through the universities as, look at these, green-haired radicals. They're never going to be able to get a job after they graduate. Ha ha ha. It was kind of a mocking contempt. But these ideas are wrong, but they're also serious. And these cohorts of activists that have been trained in the universities, it's not that they were unable to get jobs. They created their own jobs within the institutions as ideological commissars, enforcers. And so now you're being, you're being besieged by all sides in a rapid course of time. You send your kids to school, well, they're learning, critical race theory. You go to the office, well, you're being forced to put your gender pronouns. You go to maybe your civic institution, it's been hijacked by activists. And conservatives felt that they could retreat into the private sphere, that they could, have a private business, they could make money, that they could, they could worship, they have their kind of private religious faith. And they really seeded all of the great culture-forming institutions out into the open. And as a consequence, they were easily captured.
Yeah.
In universities, you have a kind of left to right ratio of academics, 10-1, 20-1, 51, 100-1.
No, it's extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, they're completely captured.
Completely captured.
Left, really.
And I think that we've made an enormous mistake by ceding this territory, because this is the lifeblood of intellectual life. And conservatives have consoled themselves to say that, well, we have our economic institutions, we have low, corporate tax rates, communism is done, we won. I think actually in some ways
gestating in the universities in these different settings.
And what we have right now is this is the new status quo. You have a very uncomfortable situation. You have, in old kind of orthodox Marxist terms, a very hyper-capitalist economic base, but you have a very left-wing or neo-Marxist cultural superstructure. These are the great tectonic plates of our society, and they're at very strong opposition right now.
The weird thing is Marx thought the purpose of the superstructure was to protect the substructure. So the capitalist economy would throw up around itself a protective. Now you're kind of suggesting, I think correctly, they're at odds with each other. The superstructure is at odds with the capitalist substructure. That's completely unstable. I mean, I just wonder what that bodes for the future, because it sort of goes against the Marxist logic.
Yeah, I think it goes against the orthodox Marxist logic, but in one sense, you have a kind of revolution on both fronts. You have a technological and economic revolution. You have an unprecedented increase in productivity in the economy. And then you have actually, in some ways, a similar cultural revolution in family life, social life, conception of race and gender and identity. And I think that so many Americans find themselves unmoored, totally at a loss.
Well, and let me ask you about that, because something I've been tracing for a long time is disaffiliation from the church. So when I was a kid, go back to let's say early 1970s, when Angela Davis and the Weather Underground were doing their work. At that time, statistically, about 3% of our country would have claimed no religion. 97% of the country at that time would have said, I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant, I'm Jewish, or whatever. They'd have some religious affiliation. It accelerated so rapidly beginning in the 90s. Now it's somewhere around between 26 and 30% of the country would say, I have no religion. And you say, well, okay, it's sort of a harmless thing. Absolutely not, it seems to me. That religion provided not just sort of a social structure for people, it provided an ideological framework. It provided a way of thinking about fundamental things. When you disaffiliate from religion, well, I mean, nature abhors a vacuum. I mean, something's going to come rushing into that vacuum, and it corresponds precisely to this time when these ideas were gestating in the universities. And if kids are disaffiliating and then hearing in college, oh, you know, God's an old fantasy, and think now the rise of the new atheists in the early zeros, right? All that produces a kind of witch's brew, doesn't it? It provides this breeding ground that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Talk about religion in relation to all this.
I think that it is one of the most important issues, and I can maybe even speak to my own personal experience. You know, I'm an Italian Catholic by birth. My father was born and raised in Italy, but I went to K through 12 public schools. I grew up going to church, to Sunday school, but in my 20s, I disaffiliated. I didn't feel
like a lot of your peers.
Like a lot of my peers. You know, I went to a Catholic college, Georgetown. You know, kind of maybe nominally Catholic college in my experience, but I disaffiliated because I didn't feel like it was speaking to me. I wasn't persuaded intellectually, emotionally, morally that my participation was essential, and I went on my way. And it was a very rough time. You know, I was focusing on my career, focusing on work, focusing on success, but at the same time there was this emotional turbulence, this gnawing sense that something was not quite right. And then it was only after I got married and had kids that I started the return to the church, and now it's had its ups and downs, but I sensed that there was an answer to these questions that I couldn't find out there in terms of my own success, in terms of the ideologies that I had kind of subscribed to at the time. You know, I was a left winger in my young days, and now that I have kids and I'm looking around to where to send them to school, I'm returning, and I'm really learning what I should have learned many decades ago.
Yeah, but see, the church lost confidence in itself at that time, and even at the university level, we didn't present our own point of view with confidence.
Yeah.
That we're coming out of this very rich intellectual tradition. There was kind of a hand-wringing quality to a lot of Catholic intellectual life. And that opened the door, too, to the invasion of these other points of view that were not wringing their hands. They were evangelizing very effectively at a time when we had sort of stopped evangelizing.
That's right, yeah. I think there was that period of the 90s. It was a kind of generic, there was no substance, there was no call, there was no... For me and for many of my peers, there was nothing that said, this is it.
Right.
You know, focus here.
You should think in a Catholic way because it's compelling and beautiful.
And I think people are hungry for it. And I know that among many of my peers who have gone through this same process are really looking about for answers, looking for a place to moor, looking for a place that offers a better answer. And I think that in some ways, it's incumbent upon Catholics or people of any faith to pursue and then express their faith in uncompromising terms.
Right.
And I think that I found, and even though I don't make a kind of religious argument in the book or even in public life for the most part, there actually are answers to these questions.
Yeah.
And it takes a bit of digging, a bit of study, a bit of work, but what we need to offer is not just a criticism of the criticism, but we need to offer an alternative that can be magnetic to some of those emotions that people are lacking or craving. And I think that the ultimate answer to nihilism is faith, and in a religious sense, but even in a broader sense. If you believe, like the people in the book believe, that society is inherently and permanently racist and oppressive, if you believe that you can categorize people by racial group and structure them on a hierarchy of oppressor and oppressed, and you believe that the only solution is to raise all of our institutions and sever our entire connection with history, with metaphysics, with faith, with our founders, with our Constitution in this country. You have to provide a vision that meets it in equal force, or else you are kind of, you're playing checkers.
Yeah, and don't get me started on that, because I've been saying for years that we have that tradition. We have a way of displaying for people these values. They're grounded in the very smartest people that have operated in Western culture, but we did lose confidence in ourselves. And we asked a lot more questions than provided answers. We tended to reduce religion to social justice, and that made us vulnerable to this because, that's all we're just presenting social justice concerns here. Oh, well, that must be a good thing. That's what our religion's all about. But if you don't see the metaphysical roots of the church's authentic social justice teaching, you'll be susceptible to this. Let me ask something else about religion that intrigues me in regard to all this business. Look at the abolitionist movement in our country, mid-19th century. Look at the civil rights movement, mid-20th century. They were led by religious people. Religious people weren't just part of it. They were the leaders of those movements. And it seems to me both of them, but especially the civil rights movement, were animated by sort of Jeffersonian democratic principles and great biblical principles. Nowhere better exemplified than King's most famous speech, right? Where he's standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and he's appealing to Jefferson, he's appealing to the Bible. And that found a deep resonance in the hearts of Americans who were also formed out of those two traditions. It struck me in the summer of 2020 when all the protests and riots were breaking out, the conspicuous lack of religious leadership. Religious people were not involved in leading those movements, and they were in fact explicitly anti-religious. And as you look deeper into the roots, you'll see, well, they don't like either Thomas Jefferson or the Bible. And so it's not surprising. That's why when people say, oh, well, this is just another expression of what Martin Luther King was saying. No, it's not. It's another mountain. This is another philosophical perspective. The lack of religious interest in wokeism and the lack of woke's interest in religion. Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an explicitly atheist ideology from the beginning, and you're exactly right. They don't appeal to the American founding. They don't appeal to any kind of religious tradition. And I always, tell people a good way to just visually show people, rather. Look at the old pictures from, 1963, 1964, 1965, the civil rights marches. It's people of a variety of racial backgrounds, and they're dressed in their Sunday best. They have nice hand-painted signs. It's optimistic. It's hopeful. The speeches are faithful. The speeches are appealing to our best instincts and our best moments as a country.
And there are a lot of Roman collars in those pictures.
And there are a lot of Roman collars, so absolutely. And then, of course, the Southern Baptist preaching and the African American church. That was the group, and you could even just see it in their expression. These are dignified, respectful. These are middle-class people who are demanding the recognition of their individual rights and their individual dignity. Compare it to an image of the crowds in 2020. It's people who, very frankly, are deranged, are unwell, are nihilistic. You look at the slogans on the wall, it's a very different tenor, a very different vocabulary. And it's people that are masked, people that are looking for destruction, people that even if you look at like the mugshots in Portland, Oregon, for example, it's people that have nothing of the quality, even just visually, as those civil rights marches. And so,
well, King was explicitly nonviolent, and the movers of 2020 were explicitly violent.
That's right.
Which comes out of a Marxist perspective. You want to foment violent class struggle for Marx. Often in 2020, it was a racial conflict, but still, you want oppressor and oppressed to come into violent confrontation. That's the opposite of what King was advocating.
That's right, and I think that it is a kind of rhetorical move that they've done somewhat successfully. Although I think in 2020 people began to see through it, but they wore the civil rights movement as a skin suit,
right?
But beneath it, it was a kind of atheistic, nihilistic, neo-Marxist ideology that sought to level all of the structures of society. And so, I don't concede for a second. And actually, even the critical race theorists, when they were on their heels, we attacked critical race theory. We made it into a national issue. we put them on their heels, they would go on television and say, well, we just want to have, fairness, and we are the civil rights marchers of our time. But you actually look at their literature dating back 30 years. They explicitly argue against civil rights law, against the 14th Amendment, against Lincoln, against the founding.
Against the idea of a colorblind society. So King's language, I remember as a kid finding so moving, I dream of a society where my children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's it. That's what I want. I still want that. But in the theorist of wokeism, they don't like the colorblind society. That's just a cover for white oppression, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And that's really the essence of the critical race theorist's academic argument. They said that America is a systemically racist society since its inception, and the society preaches freedom and equality, but this is just an ideological mask producing false consciousness in the interest of maintaining white racial domination. And so the critical race theorists go back and they say that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was actually a secret plot to entrench corporate interests and white supremacy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, any of the great moments of true racial progress in the United States are merely a smokescreen for a more sophisticated and more insidious form of domination. Even, Derek Bell, who was the godfather of critical race theory, was a mentor to who came to be a very successful, one of his students at Harvard Law, a man named Barack Obama, became the president. And so Derek Bell, towards the end of his life, in I believe 2010, someone cornered him, says, well, you say that racism is permanent, indestructible, it's the essence of life in America, but your former student, Barack Obama, is now the president of the United States.
Was elected twice as an American president, yeah.
And in this really, I mean, deeply cynical and pessimistic response, he says, he says in effect, Barack Obama is a black president of a white supremacist country. He's the black face of white supremacy.
Yeah, and Obama himself would never subscribe to that. I mean, no. I think indeed he was a student, I suppose, at Harvard of Derek Bell, but I say to Obama's great credit, he wouldn't hold to that. And I read Obama as very much standing in the Martin Luther King tradition. But the quote I think is, let's stay with the King and Derek Bell, because there's a quote that jumped out at me from your book. This is from Derek Bell. Racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of our society. Well, see, if that's true, if it's so baked into our society, then the only solution is a complete destruction of the society. It's not a matter of reforming it, calling it to conversion, or in King's case, summoning its own best qualities, Lincoln's better angels of our nature, all of that, great. But if this is true, then the only solution is a revolutionary violence that destroys the entire society. And that is a Marxist-inspired strategy.
That's right. And I think that Derek Bell in particular and the critical race theorists as a group created what I think of as a philosophy of racial pessimism.
Yeah.
They believed that equality was impossible. They believed that freedom was impossible within the confines of American society. And I think that it's not only false if you actually read the sequence of American history, if you take seriously the ideals of the American founding, and then if you even talk to people in their own daily experience in the United States. But there's an additional cynical twist on it, because Derek Bell, who wrote those words and actually became famous because of those words, was rewarded. The more pessimistic, the more acid, the more nihilistic his writing became, the more he was rewarded by his peers within academia, the more he was rewarded by NPR and the New York Times and the New Yorker, the more he was elevated as a great prophet of racial consciousness. And so he entered this spiral where he ended just a kind of pitiable figure, a prophet of racial doom. He predicted genocide in America. He predicted this kind of eternal, he preached an eternal condemnation of the society. Well, and I think that he was rewarded for it, incentivized for it. And to me, it exposes not just that his ideas are wrong, but actually our elite culture rewards people for preaching this kind of false
Like kind of self-loathing within the culture itself.
Yeah.
But, from a theological perspective, it's a doctrine of original sin with no doctrine of salvation or grace. So here's this original sin of American society, and yes, indeed, this terrible moral outrage was present from the beginning of our society and all that. No one denies it. But if it's an original sin that's so baked into the system that there's no possibility of salvation, then all we're left with is this permanent resentment, permanent conflict. And then, the conflictual nature of this, which is basic to Marxist social theory, opposed to Catholic social theory, which is a cooperative social theory. It acknowledges the differences between classes and so on, but advocates a cooperation, where Marxism, based in Hegel and a very dialectical approach, a sort of master-slave construal of society, you have to have conflict. You're trying to foment conflict. And that's where I tell my Catholic friends all the time, no, that's not our approach. That's coming up out of Hegel and Marx and then the way they got revolutionized.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that ultimately that's what people want. In the absence of, in the presence of an alternative, that's what people want. But in the absence of an alternative, I think that people gravitate towards these ideas. And certainly people in elite institutions have glommed onto these ideas. And I think that in some sense they do so cynically. They do so with the sense that there isn't something that offers them a deep satisfaction or a deep sense of meaning, but it's an ideology that is now a tool for navigating elite culture, elite institutions. It's something that you profess in your DEI statements.
Yeah.
And so we're in this really, I think, dangerous period where we have elite institutions that have abandoned their purpose across the board. You have universities that have abandoned the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. You have medical organizations that have abandoned that first dictum, first do no harm.
And how dangerous that is.
You have schools that have abandoned getting kids to basic literacy, to basic molding citizens of our republic in the interest of ideology and revolution. And we have across the board this institutional capture laterally through all of our bureaucracies.
How did it happen so rapidly? I still find that puzzling. And that these things are now at odds with themselves. I mean, so you think of a capitalist corporation and the adage now, go woke, go broke, which is happening across the board. And yet it's like they're hugging to themselves this ideology that will destroy them. How professors and teachers have tolerated. I think one of the maybe single weirdest expressions of wokeism is the view that mathematics and Western reason is by its nature oppressive. The very idea of a correct answer in mathematics. But man alive, is that dangerous stuff. When you've so bracketed the truth and you see it simply as part of a power struggle, that's the most insane expression of it. But yet we find that, don't we? Why is the educational establishment hugging that to itself?
Well, that's a very interesting specific example. And so it's the discipline of ethnomathematics. That's really what they call it, the academics in Illinois. And they say that, mathematics is not neutral, is not objective, it's not a creation of pure reason. It doesn't conform to any cosmic order. It's all chaos, it's all numbers, it's all interpretation, right? Kind of a Nietzschean, there are no facts, just interpretation. But what they do is that then it becomes two things. One, it becomes a tool to inject ideology into every discipline. And then it becomes really an excuse for not teaching kids math.
Yeah, right.
Because math is a system of oppression. You need to educate people into ethnomathematics, and everyone is rewarded based on their identity, not based on their accomplishment. And so I've done a number of reports on this. And what I like to tell people and remind people is, well, they didn't call it ethnomathematics, but the Soviets too had something similar. They had the very famous 2 + 2 = 5, which was the idea that under Soviet economic policy, you could have 4 years of production that achieved 5 years of output, because you were taking the ideology and then governing your production, your physical production or knowledge production according to it. And it was so good that 2 + 2 could equal 5. We now have kind of postmodern, racialist ideologues that have resurrected the formula. They say sometimes 2 + 2 can equal 5. It's on a postmodern basis where they have kind of some, if 2 is actually rounding down from 2.4, there's kind of a sophistic argument. But the basic argument is bringing radical subjectivity back to the process in order to foreground identity first and foremost.
Right.
That's what they're doing.
See, the problem is that's by its nature divisive. If I say it all comes down to my subjective decisions, then you got your subjective decisions and we should maybe tolerate each other, but don't you tell me what to think, I won't tell you what to think. What you end up with is this completely balkanized society, is that we're all in our own little space. And the things that can bring us together, which are objective values, like the epistemic values of mathematics, or aesthetic values, or moral values, the very things that will unite us now we've lost. And if all we're left with are subjective interpretations, then we're at odds with each other necessarily. And so it's proposed as a solution to the problem of injustice. Give me a break. It produces much more violent sort of injustice. I don't know how people can't see that, how the hugging to themselves of these movements are just undermining, what they're supposed to be doing, whether it's at a corporate level, educational level, aesthetic level. I don't know. I find that side of it just, dispiriting.
This is an important point, and it really is what's driven me to attack this ideology just unapologetically, in a way that I'm unafraid to confront it directly on its own terms. Because ultimately, I directed a film for PBS a number of years ago about 3 of America's poorest cities.
Mm-hmm.
One of these cities was Memphis, Tennessee. I spent about 3 years documenting life in a public housing project in Memphis. 100% African American. I think 95% of the families were single-parent families. And they were living in public assistance, public housing, public benefits. And so, as I'm looking at critical race theory intellectually, they speak, supposedly on behalf of groups like the folks that I met in Memphis and spent a lot of time with. And they say, in a certain sense, that we have the solution for these problems. But what I was always doing was looking at the ideology and then saying, well, in a fair way, try to be fair, say, does this have anything to offer folks like I met in the public housing project in Memphis? And over and over and over, what I discovered is that these ideologies are really self-serving for elites, for them to get status, position, influence within elite institutions, but they have nothing to offer the people that are actually at the bottom of the social hierarchy, that actually need some help, that need compassion, that need assistance. And so ethnomathematics is the perfect example. I can be the professor of ethnomathematics, I can be the headliner at the conference, I can get my academic papers published, I can have a kind of fancy title somewhere. But what does ethnomathematics offer to the inner city kid in Seattle, in Chicago, in New York City, for whom a basic mathematical education could be the way out of social injustice? It offers them nothing but resentment, will to power, and the denial of truth. And so to me, I think that what we always have to do is really, Catholics, but I'm a conservative in a political sense. We gave up on the term justice. We mocked it as social justice. But that is a huge mistake. We need to have a conception not of social justice or racial justice or gender justice, but of justice.
No, quite right.
With a capital J.
No.
And retake the term and present a vision that also in a social justice manner, meaning in our kind of temporal lives and in our social lives, that says, you know what? I can offer that kid who is struggling with his math text, he's in 4th grade, he's in a public housing project in Memphis. This is what I can offer. What you're offering is poison. What I'm offering is a way out.
Yeah.
And that to me is something that we have to do. We have to get much better at doing.
Let me say a word about that, because I think it's really right about justice. I was at a major Catholic university a few months ago, and in the Q&A, one of the kids asked me about the DEI stuff. And I said, well, here's my problem, is diversity, equity, inclusion. Say what you want about them. in our tradition, they would be values secundum quid. They'd be values according to circumstances. Sometimes, indeed, diversity is a good thing. Sometimes. Sometimes, equity of outcome is a good thing, but not always. Inclusion sometimes is a good thing. And I gave us an example. I said, you're the, director of the Chicago Symphony, and you want the very best players you can in the whole world. Are you going to be radically inclusive? Well, of course not. You're going to exclude 99.8% of the applicants. Are you going to say my prime value here is making sure my orchestra is balanced racially with 10% Black people, 12% Hispanic? Of course not. You're going to say I want the best candidates. So diversity, equity, inclusion, yes, sometimes those are good things. But what is a value in itself? Justice. And I said, for example, if you were to say no Black people can apply to the Chicago Symphony, well, no, it's unjust. That's a denial of equality of opportunity. Of course that's unjust. And that should always be in place. You should always be just. And then I said, you should always be loving. Love and justice are two values in themselves. The problem is when you take values secundum quid and you pretend they're values in se. And that's happened with the diversity, equity, inclusion thing. It's like liberty, equality, fraternity. If you take those values secundum quid and make them absolute, you're going to have trouble, in the society. Because I think that's right. Justice is what we're for. That's one of the classical values, one of the cardinal virtues. And classically, we presented that over and over again. We should still present it, and not succumb to this postmodern, nonsense that wants to question it. But that's a key distinction. And don't mistake DEI for justice and love.
Yeah.
They're not the same thing.
I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times on this very question a few weeks ago. And I asked a simple question: what is the purpose of the university? Because I've been working on university reform efforts in Florida and in other states. And the argument that I made is that the university has a mission. It's either explicit, they say this is what our mission is, or it's implicit. And my argument was that universities have lost the sense of purpose and the sense of telos, the sense of the ultimate aim. And they've substituted a bureaucratic morality of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in its place. But to me, a university should be oriented towards, classically speaking, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Yeah.
And the argument that I made is that you can have a university oriented towards the true, the good, and the beautiful, the great transcendentals, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Pick one.
Yeah. And you can't have both.
You cannot have both as the ultimate aim. And, what we've done at New College of Florida, where I'm a trustee and working on these reform efforts, is abolish our DEI department and to say, no, we are creating an institute of classical liberal education oriented towards the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that is our cardinal virtue, and we've adopted a policy of colorblind equality.
Yeah.
We'll treat anyone equally who applies. And guess what happened? We got rid of our DEI department, and we've said, this is our vision, this is our telos, we're restoring the purpose of education. And not through manipulation, not through a discriminatory policy of DEI. We've doubled the number of Hispanic students in our incoming class and quadrupled the number of Black students in our incoming class. Yeah. Again,
equality of opportunity, not equity of outcome.
Equality of opportunity, but also by creating an appeal to something much higher.
Yeah, right.
And so we've attracted people through this process of creating something that I think a lot of people are longing for. And I also tell people, they say, oh, DEI is essential because we need to have X, Y, and Z. I say, okay, well, let me think. I'm a part of an organization, my local parish. We have people from all over the world. Our priests are, a kind of European American, a priest from Africa, and a priest from the Philippines.
Yeah.
And we all submit to their leadership willingly with an open heart. And our parish is very diverse. But that's very odd. We don't have a DEI department. We don't talk about diversity. We don't talk about inclusion. They are preaching something much higher than that. And then in an automatic process, all of us kind of naturally are looking up, and then we're looking around and saying, hey, we have a shared enterprise that transcends those categories. It doesn't seek to solidify those categories. I think that's a much better approach.
Yes, it's as old as Aristotle, right? If you want a friendship to endure, the friends cannot just fall in love with each other. They have to fall in love together with a transcendent third.
That's right.
And it's a fantastic idea, and it comes up into the Christian tradition too. What makes a marriage healthy? Not just two people that fall in love with each other, but together they fall in love with God, which is why we have the wedding in church. You know, when I was doing marriage preparation, I often ask that question, like, why do you guys want to get married in church? Oh, because we love each other. And I said, well, that's great, but that's no reason to get married in church. And I tried to lead them to the point to say, together we're in love with God, and we believe that God brought us together for his purposes. But see, that's God's supreme value, the summum bonum. But all the objective values have that quality. Is if together we fall in love with trigonometry, together we fall in love with English literature, together we fall in love with economics, whatever it is, the objective value brings us together. When you bracket that, what you're left with is this fussy, self-involved, antagonistic, balkanized society. And so that's where the lack of teleology contributes to this problem.
I think I think it is the fundamental problem in our society today. All of our institutions have lost the sense of telos, and then they cannot defend it because they don't even know what it is. And I was reading the commencement address from the leader of UC Berkeley. Great institution, right? UC Berkeley. And you read their literature, you read their statements, you read their speeches and addresses, and you see these are people that are highly educated, that are successful, that have risen to the hierarchy within academia, that have no idea what it's for. None. For them, it's
why are we here?
Be a kind of partisan activist, promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's the language of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And that's their currency. But what I think is essential for us is to reopen the question of, well, what is the purpose? What is this for? And then also to reintroduce politics. And this is where there gets to be even another wrinkle of debate. But in a public university setting, in a public school setting, these are all political questions. In a K through 12 school, you have a school board, you have state legislators, you have voters and parents that are investing in these systems. They should be determining how these systems are run and which values they transmit, not the bureaucracies, not the DEI departments, not the left-wing activist teachers. And so what I think we have to do is simultaneously open a question of ends, meaning what is the purpose of these institutions, but also reinvigorate the process of means. How do we determine what these institutions are oriented towards? Who's the ultimate authority over these institutions? And to me, in our republic, it's voters that need to reassert their democratic will, their democratic desires, their democratic voice, to say that, wait a minute, we do not consent in the kind of natural rights tradition to be governed by permanent bureaucrats that hate us and hate our values. We will reassert our power and our authority against the anti-democratic forces of institutional capture, and say unapologetically, we want K through 12 schools that reflect, affirm, and transmit our values. That is our fundamental right. And if we do not have that, my fear is that we not only have institutions governed by ideologies that are dead ends, but also we have lost the basic structure of natural right, the basic structure of our Constitution. And we become, in a very real way, a post-liberal, a post-constitutional society that to me is something that is very frightening, but that is very much on the horizon.
I don't think people see, they probably see that the wokest folks don't like religion, but maybe they don't see sufficiently, they don't like liberal democracy either. I mean, classical liberalism with its institutions of, free speech and individualism and reason and a political forum in which we can have a debate, which is not just people fighting each other, but trying to find a truth together. All of that, all the presumptions of a liberal democracy, they don't like that either. So
they do not.
That's what makes it very dangerous to me.
And here's the key difference, and I think it's important for people to be able to articulate it, is, the founders who established a democratic republic, let's say a classical liberal structure of the Declaration and the Constitution, they believed that the purpose, the end of government was to secure the rights of the people to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And government was limited because it delegated as much as it could to civic life, to private life, et cetera. But the basic function was to secure the rights of the people in a Lockean liberal sense. Let's say the left-wing ideologues, the neo-Marxists, the DEI officers, they actually don't believe in that at all. That's a limited government. They want an unlimited government that manages society via bureaucracy and via applied social science, via ideology in a sense. And so they want an activist government that reshapes society according to their principle. These are different systems. These are not compatible in any way.
Do you remember in George Will's book, it's a big sort of statement of his conservative principles. And one of his observations was, the most important word in the prologue to the Declaration is secure. Because what he meant was government doesn't produce these rights or create these rights. It secures them. They're independent of the government. They come from, now Will is not a believer, and he would tend to read that more as pious boilerplate. I don't read it that way. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, because they're grounded in the creator. When that metaphysical structure falls apart, which it does after Nietzsche and company, we're on dangerous ground politically. Because you take away God, well, I mean, equality in Jefferson's sense, that's going to even us too. Because our real equality is that we're all children of God together. Our rights are going to even us because they're dependent upon the creator's will. If it becomes a question of, a bureaucrat deciding what things are going to be, if we're in a regime of complete self-invention, we're on dangerous ground indeed, And I wonder if people get that the American system that Martin Luther King would have affirmed very strongly with its biblical roots, that's called into question pretty radically by these folks.
That's right. And I think, well, and in an additional way, though, if you look at the Great Society programs, which King supported, that also is a departure, though, because the programs of the Great Society were different than the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act simply said, we want to honor the principle of the Declaration and the 14th Amendment, and we cannot have separate but equal facilities. We cannot have unequal treatment based on racial category.
Right.
We want to have equal treatment of individuals under the law. To me, that is the fulfillment of what Jefferson had envisioned, but tragically was unable to complete. But then you have kind of lumped together in the popular consciousness, well, we need to now create a bureaucracy that is capable of administering society according to social science, according to the best and the brightest, and creating equal outcomes, creating substantive equality rather than just the equality of rights. This is an extreme departure from what I think that it was intended by that Lockean liberal principle. And moreover, in my view, having studied it, having looked at it in practice, creating that film for PBS and for 3 of America's poorest cities, it also doesn't work. The societies that are most governed by the state, let's say using the public housing project as our prime example, because the physical production, the economic, the cultural, the rules, everything. It is literally a kind of government-run society in microcosm, is a disaster because it undermines and ultimately destroys the actual natural rights towards which I think human beings are oriented. Locke talks about, the family. The founders talked about the family. You have a basic system of morality. You have a sense of the transcendent. You have the organic production of the economy, of social relations. All of that is wiped out by the state. And the state Nietzsche was right in this sense. He called it, the cold monster of the state. For all of his, faults, in some sense, he had an intuition that the instinct towards socialism, the instinct towards the management of society by the state, crushed. He was concerned about genius and hierarchy in that sense. But I think it also, in a Christian sense, in a more humble sense, destroys the most vulnerable, destroys the people who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And I always tell people, go spend a couple weeks in a public housing project in the United States, and then tell me if you still believe in the vision of the Great Society. I think the evidence over and over does not stand. And I think that if you care about poor people, there is a much better way.
After trillions of dollars spent, right? That's the argument. That,
it's $1 trillion a year right now.
Yeah.
$1 trillion a year is greater than the GDP of almost every nation on earth. And we spend $1 trillion a year, more than that now, on means-tested welfare programs. In Memphis, it's something like $3 billion a year on 100,000 households. You could, that's $30,000 a year per household. That is that's a middle-class wage in most European countries. But you have something that is so profoundly horrifying. You have a neighborhood, this 38126 zip code in Memphis, where I spent a few years learning and meeting people, has 6,000, a population of 6,000, and at the time had only 12 nuclear families, meaning mother, father, and children in the home. So you have a generation of people that are growing up not just themselves in a fatherless household, but likely knowing not a single person that has a mother and the father in the home. This is the first time in human history that that's ever happened. And I think that it is naive, and actually it's cynical, and I think it's evil to say that the only solution is to, bring in, the DEI bureaucrats that get paid their six figures, that don't make any change, but are self-satisfied. To me, that is, and let's say in a social justice sense, an outrage, something that we are creating in our society that is so nihilistic and so profoundly tragic and disturbing. I think that it should shock all of us into trying to propose a better way.
There's so much there that we could talk about. I think of, the breakdown of metaphysics that we talked about, the loss of God, the loss of religion, of that kind of cohesiveness. And just the loss of a sense of what brings a society together. And a lot of this woke business is just encouraging the very worst instincts. It's encouraging the very worst tendencies within a society. They're actually driving us apart. So I could talk to you all day. We're coming to the end of our time though, but and we've been hinting at it a bit, but give me a sense of the way forward as you're looking at it right now. So we've, diagnosed some of the problems with this. We've seen the difficulties. Are there signs of hope? I mean, one that I find actually is the reaction against the extremism of a lot of the woke ideology. And I compare it to, go back to, 17th century Puritanism, or come up to the Jacobin period, go into Prohibition in the 20th century, or the McCarthy. And there's been these sort of outbreaks of a puritanical frenzy, let's say. But all four of those examples, everyone today would say, well, yeah, that's terrible. Nobody wants that. My hope is that in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, people will look back at this time and say, oh my goodness, that woke extremism was so unhealthy. I mean, is there a backlash happening? Is it already underway?
Yeah, there is, and I think it's already underway, and it's already underway on a couple of different fronts. But if you were to say, well, what is the solution? I think it is first and foremost people understanding what the problem is. You have to understand a problem in order to solve it, typically. And I think there are a number of ways that we can do it. There's the kind of individual way of solving the problem, meaning that it's open to all citizens, that is part of the fabric or the function of their daily lives. And then there's the political, those of us who are fighting in politics. And they go hand in hand. In the local sense, which is really where I'm most optimistic, what I'm seeing from parents all over the country, from families, from people within institutions, is a sense that education in particular has gone so wrong that we need to build and create alternatives. I know in my local community, we have the kind of classical Catholic education that I think is now thriving. There's one of the fastest growing education movements. You have the homeschool movement, has record numbers of people, and you have the school choice movement at the policy level. Now in 6 or 7 states, parents can opt out of the public school system and take their $7,500 per year per child and take them to any institution of their choice. This is creating an alternative market where parents can go and they could say, not only do I not have to be concerned that I'm sending my child to an institution that seeks to undermine my values, but actually this is a cooperation between the parents and the teachers and the administrators that we're going to have this joint enterprise in shaping our kids towards some higher purpose. I think that is a very much an encouraging grassroots element. And that's something that I'm finding so many people are overturning their entire lives. They're moving, they're taking a job, they're quitting a job, they're reorganizing their lives to build these alternatives. And then on the policy sense, I think that we are also making progress, because what I'd like to think of is that this is not a conflict at heart between left and right. This is a contest between the permanent bureaucracy and, let's say, elite institutions that are seeking to impose these ideologies from the top down, and then the broad middle class that opposes them. And so what I think we need to do is to have a sense, and this is going to be led by more conservative politicians who have a vested interest in responding to their constituents, to say public institutions must once again reflect the values of the public and must be ultimately accountable to the public that funds them, that charters them, that sustains them. And so what I think it is really a renegotiation of the contract, the social contract, between the people and between their government, so that we have these things are once again aligned. And that's going to be a brutal, it's going to be a difficult, and it's going to be, in a metaphorical sense, a bloody fight. But I think that those of us who are really fighting it, and really pushing in that political sense, we have to first remind people of that these are ultimately all political questions that must be settled in the democratic process, and that we have to recognize the source of the authority is ultimately the people. And I still believe, fundamentally at the deepest level, that the metaphysics, the values, and the priorities of the people as a whole is still good, is still oriented towards something that is higher, and that it's simply incumbent upon those of us in the political process to be the champion of those voices.
Yeah, quite right. And maybe we can close with this. We've been invoking King a lot. I always go back to the letter from the Birmingham City Jail, where King draws attention to Thomas Aquinas. So why are you opposing these unjust laws? Well, because a just law has got to be rooted in the moral law, which in turn is rooted in the eternal law. So he cites Aquinas right from the Prima Secundae of the Summa. And that's the relationship between politics, positive law, the moral framework. See, if the moral framework goes, then the positive law is going to be messed up. So positive law relates to moral law, and then the moral law is grounded in the eternal law of God. There has to be a transcendent summum bonum in relation to which the other goods are arranged. That's the classical view. When that was in place, there was a kind of coherence. I think what's happened is the falling apart of that coherence. And the result is a deeply antagonistic society. So I'm for Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther King and the coming together of these three, elements. And discovering that intellectually, living it out morally, that's maybe the path forward.
I think that's right. And I think that what you're talking about is the heart of the matter. And I think that it's not that people don't believe that. It's that people haven't heard that.
They haven't heard it, right?
I mean, really, truly. And so I think that's why what's really important is for all of us involved in this to come together and just try to rebuild that. I mean, it doesn't take us to rebuild it, right? It exists independent of us. But we have to breathe new life into it.
See, we lost confidence, though. We did. We lost confidence in it. So we have to find, the courage and the elan to present it again to the society.
And that's what you're doing. I appreciate it so much.
Well, listen, thank you for being with me today. I enjoyed the conversation immensely. God bless you.
Thank you. God bless.